agencies have the ability to record and listen to every phone call in the world. We've sometimes collected phone calls from an entire country for an entire month at a time. We even have done it here at home in America. For years, the NSA collected millions of Americans' data without first having an individualized warrant. James Clapper notoriously lied, as we all know, to Congress about this massive surveillance program. He's now paid to deliver highly partisan rhetoric on a left-wing news outlet. Many in the FBI have been accused of bias. Some have been convicted. Some have been let go. McCabe, Klein Smith, Peter Strzok, Lisa Page. So it's kind of hard to argue that somehow we can get people in the FBI that are above bias. It seems to be something that goes with the territory. Maybe it was a bad spate of time where we had a whole bunch of them all at once, but it's a problem. When we investigate a presidential campaign, I think it's important that we realize the potential for bias that exists in the people bringing an investigation forward, but also incredibly important that we should devolve or at least consider using the Constitution and not using warrants that are used on foreigners. So we have two different standards. We have a constitutional standard, which is typically used for Americans, where we use the Fourth Amendment. And the Fourth Amendment says you have to have probable cause, of a crime. The FISA court standard is not a Fourth Amendment. It's an extra constitutional standard. It's less than the Constitution. It's probable cause of being associated with a foreign government. The problem is that when we have presidential candidates, they're all going to have foreign policy advisors. Most of them will have long-standing history in either government of some sort. They'll have people who do talk to foreigners all of the time. So you can see how someone with bias, and I think that's what happened during the investigation that turned out to be untrue on the Russia collusion. So we had a massive investigation of a presidential campaign. And I don't think enough of us have stepped back to say, well, my goodness, should we be using FISA warrants for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court? Should we be using that kind of warrant on an American, particularly an American running for office who has all of these contacts? Do you think it's appropriate that we use FISA court warrants to investigate presidential campaigns?
What I do think is appropriate is that we use FISA warrants to investigate counterintelligence threats to the United States, as long as it's done consistent with the minimization and querying procedures that are carefully approved.
You don't think there was any problem with this investigation with the Crossfire Hurricane? You think it was all completely appropriate? Nobody in the chain of command was biased, and it just occurred because they were curious? We just indicted one of the Clinton lawyers yesterday for lying to you guys. You guys took it hook, line, and sinker and said, oh, well, we'll just investigate a major presidential candidate. Of course there's a huge problem. And if you don't see that there's a problem and that we need more controls on this and that we need to somehow obey the Constitution, I would say the same for President Biden. I would say the same for a president of any party. What a crazy upturned world where there would be, the bias is there. There's no way to get it. The reason we have checks and balances with the judiciary is so we can kind of get over the potential bias that occurs in the FBI or the CIA or anywhere else. If you don't have to go to a court and you go to a court that doesn't obey the Constitution, that's held in secret, that's not justice, and it's going to be ripe for abuse. You don't agree with that?
There are parts of what you said that I'd like to weigh in on. So first, as to what happened in the so-called Crossfire Hurricane matter, I would say to you today, and I have said publicly on a number of occasions, that what that Inspector General report describes by certain FBI personnel, I consider to be unacceptable and unrepresentative of the FBI that I see every day, having joined in 2017, and not something that I think can ever happen again. So I want to make sure that you and I are talking, not past each other on that. Now, second, I've put in place over 40 corrective measures, everything the Inspector General has recommended, and then some, to make sure that what happened there does not happen again.
I think that's admirable, and I appreciate that point of view. But, when Hamilton wrote that if men were angels, we wouldn't need the Constitution, we still are relying on angels working at the FBI. We're relying on you saying we're going to get a better set of people. We're not going to have that bias anymore. I think that's admirable. That's what I would want in someone being the director. But what we need is something beyond that. And this is what our founding fathers did when they set up the Fourth Amendment, is we had a Constitution and we had the Fourth Amendment, an incredibly important amendment, and then we had a judicial system. The FISA court doesn't obey the Fourth Amendment. It has a less than constitutional standard. It allows you to have warrants without obeying the Fourth Amendment. And people don't realize this. You use FISA warrants that do not obey the Fourth Amendment. You have a lower standard for going after foreigners. I'm actually okay with that. If you're not a U.S. citizen and you're investigating someone overseas and you're eavesdropping on them, I'm actually fine with the FISA standard. But I'm not fine with the FISA standard for Americans, particularly Americans who are running for office, particularly for the person running for the highest office who is interconnected with all kinds of countries and always will be. And once you get biased people, once there's not perfection, and we get biased people in the FBI, the problem is the system can be abused. I think the only fix, it's admirable to have some regulations and some checks and balances you put in place, but the only real fix would be we should obey the Constitution. I don't think Americans nor political candidates should be investigated using a foreign intelligence surveillance court.
Thank you, Senator, for your kind words about the corrective measures we've put in place. I would say to you that I believe the FISA court operates within the Constitution, so we might have a difference of opinion in how we characterize it. I would also say to you that as we sit here 20 years after 9/11, and as somebody who was in FBI headquarters on the day of those attacks and saw the immediate aftermath, as we started to reverse engineer what went wrong on 9/11, much has been discussed back in those years about the so-called wall that was built up between law enforcement and intelligence. And a lot of the reforms that have occurred, thanks to this Congress, thanks to the courts, thanks to the executive branch, to make sure that there is not a wall between the information sharing that has to occur, has been part of what's kept Americans safe since then. So I would want, of course, to work with you on any ideas that you have, but also to make sure that we don't rebuild the wall that made us all less safe and cost 3,000 innocent lives on the day of those attacks. Thank you.
I appreciate your opinion on the FISA court having the same standard as the Constitution. They don't. The Fourth Amendment says you have to have probable cause that someone has committed a crime or is committing a crime. It's a much different standard. The FISA court standard is probable cause that you have a relationship with a foreign government. It's a much lower standard, much more open to abuse, and you don't have a public court or judges which might protect the rights of an individual. If what happened in Crossfire Hurricane is allowed to stand and would allow the FBI to do this again, we can see a time when the intelligence agencies can completely take over our political process. It's a very dangerous thing, and I think most people got caught up in the partisanship of the time, whether they liked or disliked President Trump. And instead of really thinking about this, there still is a problem. To my mind, we need to reform the FISA system, and we should not use FISA warrants on Americans. It should be reserved because it's a